The projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 1.5, Son of Nothing But Amok, in which I continue my conversation with Joe Adamson, author of the book Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Sometimes Zeppo.
And 2 hard-boiled eggs.
And 2 hard-boiled eggs. Make that 3 hard-boiled eggs.
In the same hour I told you that Mrs. Moskowitz was expecting a blessed event. Well, last night Mrs. Moskowitz had twins. Okay, Mr. Moskowitz.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us as I continue my conversation with Joe Adamson. Having given us a concise but comprehensive history of the Marx Brothers in episode 1, there simply wasn't enough time for Joe to share his journey of researching and writing his book, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Sometimes Zeppo. That's the reason for this episode 1.5, which would be considered a bonus episode.
Bring your dog around. I'll give him a bonus, too.
When we last left Joe, he was just about to say,
there's since been a lot more work done on their biography than I do. I do a very cursory job of explaining who they were, what their private lives were like, which is a little different from those characters.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit similar, a little bit different. And I really do a cursory job of explaining the stage work, which I thought was essential because that's how those characters got created. And that's how they created their style. Mm-hmm. And what the movie studios bought when they paid them the big bucks was a style that audiences responded to. Yeah. And they developed that on the stage. They developed that in vaudeville and Broadway. So the films is what we knew, and I was really researching the films. I considered the core of the book to be Monkey Business, Horse Feathers, Duck Soup, Night at the Opera, and Day at the Races. Because all the films after that are really minor films compared to those. Yeah. I consider that they're major films. And so, and that's the way I started the book and wrote it. But I was a little bit buffaloed when I saw Animal Crackers at how good it is. It is so much better than Coconuts, I think.
Oh, I agree. It's, I may vacillate back and forth a little bit, but I think I finally have ultimately settled on Animal Crackers being my favorite. I just think it captures the essence of them, and there's so many great lines and gags that even, staginess aside, it really shines.
Tell me, Mr. Chandler, where are you planning on putting your new opera house?
Oh, I thought I should like to put it somewhere near Central Park.
I see. Why don't you put it right in Central Park?
Could we do that?
Sure, do it at night when no one is looking. Why don't you put it in the reservoir and get the whole thing over with? Of course, that might interfere with the water supply. But after all, we must remember that art is art. Still, on the other hand, water is water, isn't it? And east is east and west is west. And if you take cranberries and stew them like applesauce, it tastes much more like prunes than rhubarb does. Now you tell me what you know.
And one thing also, before this slips away from me again, the title of this episode is called Nothing But Amok. And that comes from your chapter on monkey business. It stuck with me from the time I first read the book, decades ago. You allude to the beauty of monkey business being a change from, say, Coconuts, where Groucho is burdened with running a hotel. And then projecting forward, that he does the same thing in Night in Casablanca, and then also in other Paramount films, he's running a country, he's running a college. But in monkey business, they run nothing but amok. And I love that.
I think that was a note I made to myself in 1967. The book came out, it appeared in hardback first in 1973, but I did the drafting of it all between 1967 and 1970. In 1967, I was really bouncing around. That's when I graduated from college, and I was no longer being supported by my parents as of June of 1967. And I was obviously nowhere toward getting work in Hollywood studios. which was what I came out here to film school for. And I was about to lose my student deferment because graduate students were only getting student deferment for one more year until 1968, and then that was it. So I was going to get drafted into the Vietnam War if I didn't find something to do. And what I did was just continue my film school education, and I was accepted in the graduate school. But I was really bouncing around from apartment to apartment, from girlfriend to girlfriend, and just from month to month. And I would make notes. I had this Marx Brothers idea in mind, and I would make notes to myself. And a lot of what is now text in the book came out of notes that I made to myself in 1967. And it was, and I think that was one of them. They run nothing but amok. And the actual wording came when I drafted what I called the chapter of the book. It's actually chapter 3 is nothing but amok, and it's monkey business, horse feathers, and duck soup. So we can say that what started life as a series of school papers was all put together into this book according to a plan that was cooked up by a professor I submitted the first chapter to. The first thing I drafted was the Night at the Opera chapter. So I didn't even start at the beginning. I don't know how I could have. But Night at the Opera, I was ready to write that chapter first, I think. Mm-hmm. I had an independent study course, and I thought, well, I know how I can use these interviews. I already had interviews with George Seaton, Harry Ruby, and Irving Brecker. Well, how did that happen, you say? What happened was it started with the plan, which started in December of 1966. I was still an undergraduate, and a guy named Vin DeBona was a friend of mine, and we were both really interested in the Marx Brothers. Now, you're thinking you recognize that name. Do you know where you recognize it from?
Closing credit tag, production tag at the end of one or more TV shows.
The main one being America's Funniest Home Videos.
Okay.
That's his baby. He's the producer, and he directs almost every episode of that. He was another film school student alongside. I think he was already a grad student in 1966. Interviewing Hollywood veterans had become a thing. In other words, film history was the province of people like Arthur Knight, who would just describe the early Nickelodeons and D.W. Griffith and Lillian Gish and Charlie Chaplin and the Keystone Cops and bring it up to the modern day. And that was film history. It was very loose, and people taught film history who were not film historians. So people were starting to get into, why don't we interview some of these Hollywood veterans? They're right here, and they don't have to be famous. But he said to me, you want to interview Groucho Marx? And my first thought was, he'll eviscerate us. And then my second thought was, okay, so what if he does? It's something to tell your grandchildren.
Yeah.
So I said, okay. And we tried to figure out how we could go about contacting Groucho Marx. The whole reason I was at the UCLA Film School had to do with a program that George Seaton was running in conjunction with the school, where he would take UCLA students and make them apprentices on a film project. And they could sit in on meetings and watch the shooting and see a film developed from concept to script to production to post-production, and just see how films were made. And I thought, well, if they're doing that, I had already made some films with some friends of mine in 8mm. And I thought, if there's a film school, I was in college as an English major, but not particularly happy about it. But I was told I had to go to college. Once I got my degree, I could do anything I wanted. I had a college fund being developed for me. Mm-hmm. I was going to college. I didn't want to go to college. I knew I wanted to make films, and going to college had nothing to do with making films. And then I realized if there's a place where you can go and get a degree in movies, that's the college I want to attend. So I ended up out here, but largely because of George Seaton's program. Well, Vin DeBona started asking faculty members he knew how we might go about interviewing Groucho Marx, and a guy named Marvin Borowski was on the faculty. And he said, I think George Seaton can help you with that. I think he knew Groucho. And so he knew George Seaton, who was not teaching any class or running any apprenticeship program by the time I got to UCLA. But he was contacted, and George Seaton came back and said, Yeah, I'd like to talk with you guys before you do that, but I can help you get a hold of Groucho. I'll see what I can do. So I went up and, a meeting with George Seaton was set up for me. And I had bought at the UCLA student store a spiral notebook full of blank pages, but that was where I kept track of my notes on the Marx Brothers book. And I took that with me to Universal, where George Seaton had an office. And George Seaton came in and we had this meeting, just him and me. He says, well, I'm the guy with the information and you're the guy with the questions. So I'll just let you fire away and I'll do my best to answer anything you got. Well, I had no questions. I was told he had things he wanted to tell us. So I just opened this spiral notebook to one of its many blank pages and pretended to read questions that I was, in fact, frantically making up as I went.
Now, what is it that has 4 pair of pants, lives in Philadelphia, and it never rains but it pours?
That's a good one. I give you 3 guesses.
But the main question is, what was it like
to
work with the Marx Brothers? That's the only question I really had for any of these guys. Mm-hmm. All my questions were based on that. What was it like? What did you do? Was it fun? Was it difficult? And I had an interview with George Seaton, at the conclusion of which he gave me contact information for Irving Brecker and Harry Ruby. And Vin and I went and interviewed Harry Ruby. But then I was able to get a tape recorder because Vin had a show at the college radio station and he had access to a tape recorder. So we showed up for the tape recorder at Harry Ruby's house and recorded an interview with Harry Ruby. And then I did Irving Brecker by myself, trying to work the tape recorder. In fact, I had to flip the tape over and I didn't thread it right. And I lost the whole second part of the conversation, which as soon as I realized that, I just wrote down everything that I had remembered he said. And it was done from memory. So I had these 3 interviews now, and there was information in those interviews that I knew were not in any of the books. I had read Groucho's autobiography, which is called Groucho and Me. Mm-hmm. I had read his son's book, Life with Groucho. And I read Harpo's book, Harpo Speaks.
Right.
Geez, I thought that was all that was known about the making of those films. And that's all most of us knew. Mm-hmm. And they really didn't say much, but they did say how Night at the Opera and Day at the Races were road tested. They put a tab show together and toured for 6 weeks with this show. And they did 5 shows a day. And again, tinkered with the dialogue. And that's how they developed the contract routine and the stateroom routine. The stateroom scene developed from a gag it was one gag with Groucho in his underwear. And Groucho finally said, I don't want to do a scene on the stage in my underwear. So it was modified. As they were touring with this thing, they got the idea of just throwing stagehands into the stateroom and developed the idea that crowd people into the stateroom, and wouldn't that be funny?
I came to mop up. Just the woman I'm looking for. Come right ahead. You'll have to start on the ceiling. It's the only place that isn't being occupied.
So it wasn't then inspired, because I had read, I guess, somebody's speculation that that scene had been inspired by the scene in Buster Keaton's film The Cameraman, where he's changing into a swimsuit in basically a closet with a larger guy, Ed Brophy, I believe it was.
Yeah, it's a changing room, and Buster thought it was important to have a small guy, and he used his prop guy or something, and it was Ed Brophy who became a character actor out of that appearance. But that film, The Cameraman, was sort of the training film for comedians at MGM.
Yeah.
So they had seen that. So I think
it could have informed it anyway.
It grew out of that. If you look on the IMDb, you'll see Buster Keaton credited as one of the writers on Night at the Opera. He wasn't. Okay. He wasn't there. He wasn't at the studio. But that's the reason. There is a connection between that scene in The Cameraman and the stateroom scene. Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
But it was something that developed. You say, maybe we'll do something like that. That's how a lot of comedy develops. Maybe we'll do something like that, but we'll alter it for your character, and we'll do it this way. And the comedian says, well, maybe this would work better, and eventually you have a brand new scene.
Sure.
And that's how they all worked. But the Marx Brothers were really brilliant at doing that. And they did have a little bit of help from their uncle, but it was largely their own genius in comedy that developed this. But Irving Thalberg, that's how they did Night at the Opera and Day at the Races. And Irving Thalberg thought that that's what they should do, is get back to not Broadway theater, but vaudeville theater, popular theater. Just get back to doing the tab shows that they used to do, like Home Again, and do the film as that and develop the scenes that way.
Yeah,
and
putting it in front of a live audience for the feedback.
In front of a live audience. And the writers would go along with them and do it. And Night at the Opera and Day at the Races were done that way. And that is described in Arthur Marx's book. And so because of that, I had a better handle on Night at the Opera. But I also knew that Bert Kalmer and Harry Ruby wrote the first draft of the script of Night at the Opera. And everything was developed from that. I later found that script. I found a copy of that script at MGM and was able to read it and take notes on it. So that's in the book. But
yeah, that's one of the things I enjoyed about the book too, was the instances where you've seen the story drafts and early scripts and things like that, and so you're relating some alternate versions of these films that sound fascinating.
Well, I've already said how the contract routine developed. Or no, I guess I haven't. I didn't say.
You alluded to it.
It developed from one line in the Kalmer and Ruby script where he says, Groucho says, all right, look, here's the contract. Party of the first part shall be known in this contract as the party of the first part. And Chico says, that's good enough for me. And they signed the contract. That was it. That was all they had in the script. But they would take a thing like that, and if it got a laugh, would develop it.
Now it says the party of the second part should be known in this contract as the party of the second part.
Well, I don't know about that.
Now what's the matter?
I don't like the second party either.
Well, you should have come to the first party. We didn't get home till around 4 in the morning. I was blind for 3 days.
That had already been developed, I think, before they took it on the road. But Thalberg thought that's what they should do. Duck Soup was considered a box office disappointment, their last Paramount film. And Chico was playing cards with Thalberg and said, people say my brothers and I are washed up. I don't think we're washed up. And Thalberg said, no, you're not washed up. But what you need to do is get back to popular theater. And so that was the idea from the beginning. In the book, I say gradually the idea of the tour developed. Apparently that idea was there at the beginning. I know now.
You know, there's a question I want to ask, and this is kind of out of left field and maybe unfair, but it's a thought that occurred to me. The most noteworthy director that they ever had was Leo McCarey on Duck Soup. And the sense I get from your book talking about Night at the Opera, Day at the Races, is Sam Wood was a good director for them in the sense that he just kind of got out of their way. I can't help but wonder at MGM, if they'd been directed by Ernst Lubitsch, would that, do you think that would have resulted in something brilliant, or would it have been such a conflict of disciplines and sensibilities that it would have been a disaster?
I think somewhere in between those two poles, those are the two possibilities. And I think you would have ended up with something between those two extremes. You would have had a modified Marx Brothers. The
common theme being Sig Ruman.
That's true. That's true. Sig Ruman is in Notchka, and I'm not sure.
To be or not to be, wasn't he?
And To Be or Not to Be, absolutely. Yeah. And he's very good. And in Only Angels Have Wings, which is Howard Hawks directed, and Howard Hawks was a big fan of comedy. He plays a character completely different from the character he plays in Night at the Opera, Day at the Races, or the Lubitsch films. He's always playing a dignitary, sort of like Vernon Dent in the Three Stooges pictures. He plays a kind of self-important person, and in Only Angels Have Wings, he's chief cook and bottle washer for a bunch of aviators in South America, and a much more down-to-earth, nice guy, much more of a nice guy, and less of a pompous fool, which is his role in the two Marx Brothers, the three Marx Brothers pictures he's in. Right, also in Night in Casablanca.
So you're willing to give yourselves up, are you?
Yes, if you let the Rosa sing.
Well, I am managing director, and Rosa does not sing. But the rest of your proposition, giving yourselves up, that rather appeals to me.
I mean, Lubitsch was at MGM around that time, so I just thought, I wonder what could have been.
He was at Paramount when they were at Paramount, and you may know it. There was a he had an idea for how a Marx Brothers film should start. It should start with a husband coming home and discovering Groucho in bed with his wife. And Groucho's excuse is, would you believe I'm just waiting for a streetcar? And a streetcar comes through the bedroom, and Groucho gets on it and rides off, which Lubitsch would not have done in any but a Marx Brothers picture.
Yeah.
You know, and that was a good merger of the Marx's and Lubitsch's sensibility.
I had forgotten about that. That sounds familiar, so I must have read it somewhere.
They never detailed, apparently it never got detailed beyond that one gag. I mean, it's a good way to start a picture, but where do you go from there?
Right.
Groucho said the script went downhill from there. I'm not sure there ever was a script. And I think Paramount would not have been crazy about its two prime assets being merged into one film. You just didn't do it that much in those days. But I think the way Duck Soup came about was Horse Feathers apparently went through the roof, like Safety Last and The Gold Rush, and some of the pictures. Each Marx Brothers picture had been more successful than the one before it.
Well, they got the cover of Time magazine for that one too. Yeah,
Horse Feathers just went through the roof. Also through the roof that same year, 1932, was Leo McCarey's film with Eddie Cantor made for Sam Goldwyn called The Kid from Spain.
Right.
Those were the two top grossing comedies of that year. So the idea was, hey, if we can get the Marx Brothers teamed up with Leo McCarey, we're going to have the box office blockbuster of all time.
Yeah.
And I asked somebody to help me with research for the trades in 1933. And she came away with the feeling, which she wrote down for me. There was no film that got more publicity in the trades in 1933 than Duck Soup. Paramount had a different ad for it every week and just pushed it. And it almost could not help but be a box office disappointment after a buildup like that. But some people are saying now that it was a flop. I kind of hinted at that in the book, but I had no evidence for that. It's just, it was considered a big disappointment, and the Marx Brothers were considered to have reached the end of their film career. And then Thalberg revived them by saying, you got to get back to the popular stage. I have found out since then, Duck Soup was the sixth highest grossing film of that year of 1933. Not the sixth highest grossing Paramount film, the sixth highest grossing film. It was one of Paramount's highest grossing films, but they attributed their rescue from bankruptcy to Mae West, who had two big hits that same year. And because she was the big sensation, she took a lot of the oxygen out of the room. Her two best films were the films she made in 1933. So we don't know, but there are people who criticize Duck Soup now. I am one of the people who agrees. I think it's all things considered, I think it's their best film. I think it has problems, and each one of their films is an anomaly in some way.
Right. And this one, for instance, you didn't have the piano and harp solos, yet you had Margaret Dumont again.
Yeah. Well, it is an anomaly that way. And some exhibitors thought that was the reason why it was a disappointment. They said they should have more of their music in, not less. But McCarey was bored by those numbers, and Groucho was bored by the harp and piano numbers. And there always was the feeling, as far back as the Animal Crackers stage production, that maybe it's time to retire the harp and piano solos. And they did. It opened, apparently the first performances were without the harp and piano numbers. And then, Harpo said, I don't know, I think this show needs something. It needs something aesthetic. And I said, what do you mean aesthetic? And he says, oh, you want to play the harp. And Chico came in and said, hey, if that son of a bitch plays the harp, I am playing the piano. And they were big hits with audiences. They went right back in. They were in all the films up to Duck Soup. And McCarey, he shot a lot of plot stuff and other musical numbers and built up Zeppo's part. And then he cut that stuff. So it's pretty short, for the film that had that much work put into it, and time and shooting time and pre-production time and script revisions. And it ends up pretty short because a lot was filmed for it that got cut. Script material exists on this stuff. Yeah. And I'm told that people have spoken to archivists at Paramount who say that footage still exists, but they can't put their fingers on it right now. They don't know how to put their hands on it. And it's like, well, eventually it's just going to get lost.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing, too, that I appreciated about your book was that you're referring to Room Service as not being a Marx Brothers movie. And what you mean by that, of course, is that it was not tailored for them. It was a play that existed that they were shoehorned into. And from my standpoint, it's painfully obvious. It's one that I have trouble watching for that reason. I mean, for all their faults, At the Circus has Margaret Dumont and Lydia the Tattooed Lady. The Big Store has the Harpo Chico piano duet, and Margaret Dumont again. But Room Service is, I frankly enjoy Love Happy more, which I think is maybe their cutest film. I mean, it's, it's got Vera Ellen in it and all that, but it still doesn't feel like it's not something created for them the way Room Service does. They just, I'm almost uncomfortable watching it.
Hello, boss. Ha ha. The rehearsal, she's a wonder. Yes, sirree, it's a wonderful. I still think it's a terrible play, but it makes a wonderful rehearsal.
The thing is, Room Service, people who don't know who the Marx Brothers are may not be aware that Room Service was a kind of theatrical classic. I mean, it was when I grew up, it was a perennial. People were always staging productions of it, and it just kept coming back.
And of course, there was the musical remake with Frank Sinatra, Step Lively, and it was even adapted as an episode of The Monkees on the TV show. Oh my gosh,
that I didn't know.
Yeah.
But there is a myth. There's another Marx Brothers myth is that the Marx Brothers did it on Broadway. But it wasn't. It was a Broadway show that they never appeared in.
Yeah.
And RKO's idea in doing it was they paid a record amount for the film rights to this theatrical hit. Mm-hmm. And they paid an astonishing amount of money to get the Marx Brothers. So really, Groucho and Harpo made their fortune on Night at the Opera, Day at the Races, and Room Service. Paramount never gave them all the money that they were entitled to by the contract. And their later films were not quite as big a deal. And some of the financiers of Night in Casablanca, I think they did okay with that. But Night at the Opera, Day at the Races, and Room Service really made their fortune. And what RKO discovered was, after paying all this for the rights to the classic play and the rights to get the Marx Brothers, Room Service grossed in theaters about like a Wheeler and Woolsey comedy would have, which were made much more cheaply. Yeah. So they really, I don't think, made money with that, although over time, I think they probably did. What's called the back end, the DVD and TV reissue and all that kind of stuff, that was not considered part of how a picture did when you were working in the Depression. And they just there
were no other uses for the films anticipated beyond a possible re-release at that time.
Yeah,
they weren't factoring in television, let alone home video or anything like that.
And you didn't re-release a film unless it was The Birth of a Nation or Gone with the Wind or Safety Last, Gold Rush, City Lights. Chaplin, of course, would reissue his films and insist on high prices for them. The accounting, as it was done in those days, pre-television, and again, there was television in the 30s, but it would be USC. USC would broadcast a chemistry lesson from 4:15 to 4:30, and they would pick it up at Caltech and UCLA, and that was television in the 1930s. But that was going on. I mean, people think television started in 1948. In fact, there was a lot of activity. There was television at the New York World's Fair in 1939. Right. Bars would have television, but what could you see?
Yeah. The screen the size of your wallet.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what was being broadcast?
As far as programming, yeah.
It's just those chemistry lessons, or if there was a concert, they might set up TV cameras and broadcast the concert. Yeah. But very, very few sets were around to pick it up. It just was this little thing, and Milton Berle helped kind of television hit the big time, and that's what happened in 1948.
Yeah.
But yeah, all Room Service and all that was pre-television. I think what happens is, as soon as the Marx Brothers show up, you kind of expect you're going to get something like what happens at the end of Night at the Opera, where they crash the opera house, And Room Service is a play that it's a one set play. It all takes place in the hotel room of the guy who's trying to produce the show. He's trying to get a backer. He's got the manager complaining. He's making deals with the room service people that he can get meals and feed his cast.
Sasha, could you get us a meal out of the hotel?
But they shut you off room service.
I know, but if you could make a little mistake like delivering the right meal to the wrong room.
We got a terrific part for you.
Yes, but it's so terrific that unless Davis gets some food in his system, he'd be too weak to tackle it.
And his cast remains off stage. The whole play is off stage for the entirety of the show. We're just discussing the play as something happening out there. Well, you can't do that in a film.
Right.
So in the film Room Service, Murray Riskin has got one scene where all of a sudden we see a little bit of the play and people are saying dialogue, but you don't get any sense of the Marx Brothers running wild through anything but that hotel room.
Yeah.
And in the end, it's sort of like, is that it? Is that all you got? And RKO put a lot of money into getting the Marx Brothers and getting Room Service.
Right.
And they were not happy with the results. So it was considered kind of tepid at the time. But expectations for it were very high. I talked about it with Maxine Marx, who was a teenager at that time, Chico's daughter, Maxine. And she said, I was right in there with everybody else. I thought it was going to be great. Everybody thought it was going to be great, including the Marx Brothers. And Riskin did the best he could, but I think he had limitations on what he could do. Yeah. And how could you just sit down and write a scene like what Harpo does, what Harpo and Groucho and Chico do at the end of Night at the Opera? It's just an incredible thing. And that took a lot of work to create. So it's sort of like, no, we're just going to do Room Service. It's an established play. We got the rights. We're going to do it here. And Groucho and Harpo and Chico tackled 3 of the roles in the original play and adapted them to their characters as much as they could and did the best they could to play this the right way. And
it's interesting that they were so hamstrung by the material like that, because it really, I mean, as long as film rights have been acquired from other sources, I mean, it's not uncommon to just, grab the title for the cachet that it brings, and then we just do our own thing. I mean, strike up the band. And it seems like the Marx Brothers, it would have been the perfect opportunity to do that. I mean, you could, maybe stay with the same premise, but otherwise just...
Anything goes is another example of that. But
sure.
Murray Riskin told me that that's what happened with Stage Door. And Stage Door is now considered a classic. We ran it at UCLA when I was there, and it didn't go over very well. But Stage Door has a lot of the character names from the original play. I don't think there's a single line of dialogue that survives from the play in the film. And it was changed while they shot it. So Murray Riskin was writing ahead of the camera. But yeah, that does happen, and maybe something like that should have happened on Room Service.
Okay.
I did start with Night at the Opera. And I took what you could do as a graduate student, which was an independent study course. Mm-hmm. So it's not a course that I had to attend classes and listen to lectures.
Right.
It was a course where I was expected to do some research and turn in material. And I thought this is a way to use my Harry Ruby, George Seaton, Irving Brecker interviews. I knew I had stuff that nobody else had. I thought, I know what I'm going to have to do. I'll write this up. I'll combine it with what is known about these films and write it all up, and I'll get 4 units for it. I started to work on it and looked at the enormity of what I was thinking of, and I said, this is not going to be 4 units. This is going to be 8 units. I'm going to take that course twice. Well, it turned out by the time I finished 40 pages, which is about the right amount to turn in, it was 40 pages on Night at the Opera. And I didn't know where it was going to go from there, but I turned it in. I said, well, let's see how he reacts. Well, he flipped. He absolutely loved it. My professor loved it. And he loved it for all the things you just said. In other words, it had the tone that you perceived in the book. That was there in those 40 pages. It was not the Night at the Opera chapter that you read, because I had not seen the Calmer and Ruby script. I found out a lot of details on the film, what got laughs and what was rejected, as I did my research. I did further research, and that was part of his plan. He read the plan, had a series of meetings with Dr. Suber, who has since published some books of his own, which I recommend. They're very good. But he looked at this and he saw that this had publication potential. He said, you've got to finish what you started, and I'm sure you'll find a publisher. Well, that put my life on more of a track than it had been for the last 6 or 8 months, because I was out of school. I had to do something, or I was going to get drafted into the war. And I didn't know what the heck I was going to do. And now I had a plan. He said, here's my plan. The school year was divided into 4 quarters of 10 weeks each. We didn't do semesters anymore. Each quarter, you will turn in a chapter like this until you've done all of their films. And then we'll find a publisher. And he says, and this could be your master's thesis. And I went, no, none of that. And he said, why? And the reason I just didn't want to do it as my master's thesis was I thought I was going to have to do it a different way. I thought as soon as you do it as a master's thesis, I envisioned, all the college professors in horse feathers coming down on me in their caps and gowns saying, you have to write complete sentences. You can't use these puns, and you can't, take this lightly. And you've got to be serious. You've got to do it. And I didn't want to do a serious tome on the Marx Brothers. Yeah.
No rock music references.
And Howard said, yeah, I didn't know I was going to put those rock music references. That kind of crept in as I was doing it. Howard said, Joe, I'll be the chairman of your thesis committee, and I will populate your thesis committee with people who will be sympathetic to what you're trying to do.
Exactly. The professor is right.
You just write this the way you want to do it. And that I couldn't resist that. Yeah. That was a better deal that anybody had offered me in my previous 2 years plus at the film school. So that was the gag. And so now my life was on track, and I felt, all right, now we're doing something. And I started bugging George Seaton for information on Day at the Races, because I figured I'd do Day at the Races next. Mm-hmm. And he said we wrote 17 scripts for that before it finally reached the screen. And I said, well, did you have this in it? Did you have that in it? And he got tired of hearing my questions and saying, I don't know, because he didn't remember what was in these scripts. And he said, wait a minute, I'll call MGM and see if I can get you those scripts. And he did. He called MGM, and I could look at all the scripts. He said, just bring up all the script material you have on Day at the Races. And they put it in an unused office for me on the lot. But what I had to do was read them on the lot. In other words, I could not take them off the lot, which makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I went in there at 9 a.m, and I had till 5, and I didn't stop for lunch. And I know the shorthand alphabet. All through college, I took my notes in a shorthand language called Notehand. It was designed for college students. And people say to me, do you know shorthand? And the answer is yes and no. I know the alphabet, and I know how to write things. I wrote the whole draft of that book in Notehand, which is to say, common everyday words are just little scribbles that other people can't read. But
reminds me when I discovered the Greek alphabet in a big dictionary in our house one day, and I don't know, it just seemed like a fun thing to do. I memorized it and started going, in school, and I started taking my notes in Greek, not the language, obviously, but just using the alphabet. And
oh my gosh.
I remember there was 1 or 2 kids who were kind of slackers who liked to try to, cheat looking at my notes and everything. Drove them crazy.
I know. People would say to me, can I borrow your notes? I missed class on Wednesday. And I said, well, you can borrow them, but you can't read them.
ZVBXRPL. I had that same horse when I had my eyes examined. Hey, ice cream. What about this optical illusion you just slipped me? I don't understand it.
They'd have to borrow notes from somebody else or have me read them to them. I mean, I didn't have a phone. I couldn't take a picture of the pages. I don't think they would have let me do that if that was technically possible. I couldn't Xerox them. So I just had scribbled things down. And I just wrote things down very quickly in terms of what was being done. And that's when I read the script, Peace and Quiet. I mean, I read everything that day. I had never seen it before. I had to read it and get my notes and go on to the next thing. And by 5 o'clock, I was done. But I'll never forget that day.
Wow.
So when I submitted the Day at the Races chapter, that chapter is fundamentally the chapter that's in the book. I made tweaks and little changes since then, little revisions. But basically, at the end of the winter quarter, 1968, I turned in 40 pages on Day at the Races, and it had, here's what the first treatment had. The second treatment had this. Peace and Quiet was a whole script, and it had some wonderful things, whole jokes that the Marx Brothers never, ever did on film.
It'd be great to see that put together and published as a book.
Mm-hmm. And there would be funny things in that. You know, I'm reading the treatment, and all of a sudden it says, in this scene, there will be some discussion over the hero's horse or some horse or other. And it said, the horse is a magnificent animal who, for want of a better name, we shall call Zeppo. And that killed me. So, of course, I got that down.
Yeah.
And I just had to tear through this. And then I turned my notes into prose, and that became the chapter. And that's still basically the chapter as it stands now. There's little tweaks. But Howard Zuber got that at the end of winter quarter 1968, and he said, boy, that's nearly perfect. You know, he liked it better than he liked the Night at the Opera chapter. And so I was really sailing along. We referred to them as chapters, even though later they were combined into things that were actually called chapters in the book.
Yeah.
So chapter 4 is Du Fury Honor. That's Night at the Opera and Day at the Races. The next chapter I did was Horse Feathers, and there just wasn't that much material for it. It was shorter than the other two, and it just didn't have the same reaction. So I was very disappointed. Now, over the summer, I started the monkey business section. And what I would do is write all the description where I have the dialogue, and then I have my commentary on the action, all of that stuff. I wrote that first, and I would type it up and circulate it. I submitted it to Howard Zuber. My friends would read it. And I would get reactions, and I would make revisions and then incorporate that into the history of making the film. And that would be the final version I submit at the end of the quarter. I had a lot to do. And I wrote my description of monkey business up from a tape, quarter-inch tape I had made when I was film commissioner of my dormitory in 1966, 1967. And I ran monkey business as part of my film series, and I made a quarter-inch tape of the track. So I had that, so I was able to write intelligently about it. And I thought I had a good coverage of the material. My girlfriend by then was Lindsay Duran, who is now famous as the producer of Sense and Sensibility. She's the one who got This Is Spinal Tap green-lighted at AFCO Embassy. And she was head of United Artists for a while. Well, her father was a film producer, and that was not surprising to me that any of this happened. But I mean, at the time, she was just another film student. And she really liked my book. She read the chapters, but she read that part of monkey business and said, I don't know, it's not there yet. And I was so depressed after the bad reaction to what the Horse Feathers chapter had gotten that I really considered giving up at that point. She said, no, you got to finish this, and, encouraged me to keep at it. She said, you'll get there. Yeah. Well, the monkey business chapter, again, if you read the monkey business chapter in the book, that's essentially the monkey business chapter that I submitted in the middle of the fall quarter at UCLA. I finally went to Howard and said, this is ridiculous. I was now a teaching assistant at UCLA, and I have to grade a bunch of papers, and I've got 175 papers to read at the end of the term, and that's when I'm supposed to finalize my next chapter for the book. It doesn't matter when I submit it to you. Just give me 4 quarters credit, and I'll keep writing the book. And that's what we did. So in the middle of the fall quarter of 1968, I submitted the monkey business chapter. He went nuts again. Mm-hmm. And those 2 chapters became my star chapters. In other words, if I sold people on the idea that I'm doing a book on the Marx Brothers, I'll send you a chapter. It would either be the Day at the Races chapter or the monkey business chapter. The Day at the Races chapter got published in a magazine called Cinema Journal. So that was the first time I'd ever appeared in print outside of college publications. And that was the beginning of the Marx Brothers book appearing in print. That one chapter, part of the Day at the Races chapter, appeared. It was called The 17 Scripts of Day at the Races. And
Oh,
it was basically the coverage of those scripts, all based on my notes of that one day. But the Monkey Business chapter was submitted to the American Film Institute when I applied for a fellowship, and I got the fellowship. And that was money. And until then, I was just getting by on what I could make as a teaching assistant. And my summer job working for Dr. Suber's oral history program. That now things were really solid. And I had an apartment where I could function. And that's how I finished the book. But first I had to finish, let's see what happened. In October of 68, I started the duck soup section and submitted that in the middle of the next quarter, submitted that early in 1969. And that got another middling response. So basically, I had 2 star chapters and 3 chapters that needed work, but I was getting more material all the time. I knew that there was a Kalmar and Ruby script for horse feathers in Madison, Wisconsin, but how was I going to get to Madison, Wisconsin? Well, in 1969, I had it. I got this fellowship and I said, that's it. And I took work with me. I took my notes for The Night in Casablanca. I had finished by then At the Circus, Go West, and Big Store. I finished those sections. And I took my notes with me for The Night in Casablanca and Love Happy sections of the book. And I went to my family. My family owns an island in Minocqua, Wisconsin. And I got to go see my family again. And it was the first time I'd seen them for a couple of years, I think, since I graduated. And I got a break from this. I also took some transcripts for the oral history program that I had to edit. And that's what I ended up doing. It was so frenzied, my turning in these chapters and grading papers and working for a living and trying to also cover the bases on my other academic subjects. I shot 2 films and I got academic credit for that. But I would shoot the films one quarter and then get 4 credits that were credited to me the next quarter. So I had to balance all of this stuff and juggle money and move from one apartment to another. The pressure of all that just got to me. To when I got to Minocqua, I just took the month of July off. The month of August, similarly, I did other things. I did everything but the Marx Brothers book because that had become the 600-pound gorilla that I was carrying on my back. And,
sure.
I needed a break. So that's what happened there. Came back from the summer. I got a good apartment with a friend of mine named Michael Barlow, who has since become a studio executive, had a lot to do with the film Mississippi Burning and other films. But again, he was just a friend, but a supporter of the project and a connection to the American Film Institute, where I was able to go now for screenings. But my life had just evolved from being nowhere and not, being at loose ends, not knowing where I was going. So now I was the winner of this fellowship. I won another fellowship from another organization. It was $2,000, which was, roughly $4 billion in today's money. But I mean, that's about how much it was worth to me. It just redid my life. And I was working as a teaching assistant, and that work got a whole lot easier. I was going to say, Howard Suber put that thesis committee together the way he said he was going to. One of the guys he tagged for the thesis committee was the guy who said, I get films from William K. Everson, every year. And he did finally screen Animal Crackers for me. And of course, he was completely sympathetic to the project. At UCLA Film School in the 60s, it was the now generation. Everybody's mind was at the current thing. The summer of 1967 was the Sgt. Pepper summer. Mm-hmm. And in the midst of that, I've got my idea. I want to do this thing on the Marx Brothers. A lot of my friends are going, who cares about films that were made in the 30s? I'm making a film now that's really going to change everything. And of course, none of those films you have ever heard of, because they had their screenings, they got their applause, or they got their orchids or onions, and they've been forgotten, most of them, even the good ones, even the ones that I worked on, that I put a lot of time and energy into at the time. But people are still reading that book. They're still selling it on eBay. They're still talking about it on Facebook. And I mean, it's like It's like it was yesterday. But I mean, at the time, it was just something that I and a few friends in the American Film Institute knew about. There were several attempts to get it into print. Howard Suber said, I'm sure we can find a publisher for you. But every time he found somebody, like the publisher of Film Quarterly, University of California had, they put out film books from time to time. And he met the people involved in that stuff. And he said, I got a student who's writing a great book on the Marx Brothers. And they said, well, have him send me a chapter. So he told me, send them a chapter, don't argue with me, just send it. No cover letter, nothing. I just put it in an envelope, sent it to the address. And I got very polite rejection letters back saying, oh, apparently you were thinking this might be an article in our magazine, in Film Quarterly, or this might, here's why we're not going to publish this. That's all I had. And as I got toward the end of finishing this, I started thinking, geez, I've invested an awful lot of time and effort into this. I'm older than I was when I started this. I'm a different person. Actually, you're not a different person, but I felt like I had gone down a very large rabbit hole. And I said, how am I going to find a publisher for this? Which I finally did. But I mean, as you know, and anybody hearing this can tell, yeah, it came out as a book. But I didn't know that, even as I finished the first draft. I came back, I wrote the end of the book, and then I wrote the whole beginning of the book, the whole stage career. And at the end of February, I'm going by my notes here, at the end of February 1970, I completed the book by Howard's plan. You just complete a chapter every term until you've got the thing finished. By the time I finished it, I realized the Night at the Opera chapter and the Horse Feathers chapter and the Duck Soup chapter needed so much work. They were going to have to be revised. And what I had was a series of papers that had been submitted for graduate school. I didn't have a book. I was going to have to do a whole second draft of this thing. And I knew that. By the time I finished it, I could see. It was quite apparent that I had a series of papers, not a book. Even though all those papers were written with the idea, there were references in them to things that I hadn't written yet, but I knew would be in a previous section, So it was written with the idea of it being a book, but by now the project had evolved to such a point that the early work just all had to be changed. Night at the Opera, I just kept finding out more and more about Night at the Opera the more work I did. And I finally interviewed Maury Riskind. So, I mean, got more of a sense of what it was like to work with the Marx Brothers and have stuff performed on stage and then meet with them again. And I was going to have to revise the whole thing. So that was a new project. It was now end of February of 1970, and I couldn't carry this on much longer. My teaching assistantship was coming to an end. I was going to have to figure out, again, what am I going to do with my life? And I got a job teaching at Penn State. They needed somebody. I asked around, and a friend of mine, David Shepard, had been teaching at Penn State, and he knew they were not happy with the guy they had. So he said, this was a theater arts department at Penn State. They knew and cared nothing about film. But David Shepard had been teaching film there, and when he said, you want to get Joe Adamson, they just bent over backwards to get Joe Adamson. And
I'm assuming this is the David Shepard.
This is the David Shepard.
Yeah.
He was working for the American Film Institute as an archivist. And he's the one who loaned me his print of Animal Crackers for me to. But I mean, I didn't have any public showings of it. I didn't charge money. So I wasn't going to, infringe on Paramount's copyright, which had been turned over to Universal at that point. So now I had a job. My teaching assistantship could only last to the end of the school year in 1969, 1970. I had to do something, and I had a job at Penn State. They flew me to Pennsylvania and interviewed me, and David told me, you've pretty well got it. So now I said, all right, in these intervening months, I've got to finish this book. I've got to write an entire second draft on this book. When I talked to Gerald Mast and told him it took me 3.5 years to finish this book, he was surprised that it took that long. And, the reason it took that long was how much else was going on. I would have loved to have just been in a situation where I could get up on Monday morning and start writing and stop Friday at 5:00 and have a nice weekend off and go back to work again on Monday. That's not how it happened. I was working for a living. I was a student. I was putting myself through graduate school. I was supporting myself. And that's how I ended up banging from one apartment to another. I broke up with the girl I was living with, and I had to find another apartment. Found an apartment with the guy, and I was still involved in film projects. So like every weekend, I was off shooting somebody else's film. He was so depressed by this that he kicked me out. So I had to find an apartment in the middle of a school term where I'm trying to write the Day at the Races chapter and trying to shoot another friend's film. Just insanity. And it really that's why that school year of 69 to 70, it really cooled down to where I could think and I could reread my stuff and go, yeah, this needs tweaking. I workshopped those manuscripts very heavily. They were read by Lindsay Duran, who I mentioned, Michael Barlow, who I mentioned, and a friend of mine named James Morrow, who is a name that some people will recognize who may not know who the Marx Brothers are. But Jim knew who the Marx Brothers were. I had made films with Jim back in Philadelphia, and he's now pretty well known as a novelist. But he went through, and some of the best gags in the book came from him. When I discovered in my research, I was going through clippings, and I found that the circus tent, the big top tent that they used to shoot at the circus, had been made of imitation silk. And that was a big deal in the publicity for that film. When I discovered that, I thought, well, geez, what's that got to do with Groucho, Harpo, and Chico? All I wrote in my first draft of that chapter was, I guess they thought we were going to notice all that. I guess they thought we were going to notice how nice it was, how this was imitation silk. I'd seen at the circus several times by that time. I had never noticed anything special about the tent they were using. So I said, I guess they thought we were going to notice all that. I shipped the chapter off to Jim, and it came back in the margins next to that. It said, even the imitation silkworms in the audience didn't notice. Well, I mean, that's the kind of thing that Jim would come up with. I wouldn't have thought of that in a million years, but that's now in the book. But I had comments and, gags, ideas that other people would suggest. And it was just constantly evolving. So the second draft was finally done. I had more responsibilities as a teaching assistant in that last term in the school year 69-70, the spring quarter. And all of a sudden, Kent State happened. And this is a part of American history that I don't know that kids get in school. Kent State happens. There were demonstrations on the UCLA campus. My friends were in there. I was in there too. When we found out 4 kids had died because the National Guard fired rifles into the air, and Crosby, Stills, and Nash wrote "Find the Cost of Freedom." The entire college and university system of the United States went out on strike. Classes were canceled. The film school became a series of screenings of revolutionary films that they dug up from, Berkeley, and the San Francisco Newsreel was a whole organization that was just bent on making cinema verite documentaries that were anti-establishment. And they were screening this stuff every day. And I said, I'm a teaching assistant for the classes that are no longer being held. Am I still going to get paid? And Dr. Super said, he was now Dr. Howard Super. Dr. Super said, well, sure, you'll be paid. It's not your fault that all this has happened. So I was paid to sit at home and redraft Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Sometimes Zeppo. And this went on for months. I mean, I would get up in the morning and go to work on this thing and work all day, break for dinner, work all night. When I just had it, I would turn the lights out, go to bed. I was rooming with my friend Michael Barlow. He was off working at the American Film Institute every day. The next day, get up and do the same thing. The third day, it was pretty hard to apply myself to those damn pages. And I would take a walk on the beach or something and then sit down and back to work again.
More bad news.
I was drafted in the middle of that.
Didn't I tell you?
But technically, the draft board couldn't draft me, but they did. They said, you will report to this physical on February 3rd. Or on February 3rd, they sent the letter that said you report to a physical on such and such a date. And I talked to my advisor about it, and he said, no, they absolutely can't do that because you have your file open. Basically, if you are trying to get a deferment on religious grounds or academic grounds or whatever, your file is open. They can't draft you while you're doing that.
Oh, okay.
And so I said that. I sent a letter to my draft board saying, you can't mean that because I'm applying for a conscientious objector deferment on religious grounds. And their response was, yes, we can. Well, legally they couldn't, but they were sticking by their guns. So
to speak.
My advisor told me, go down and take the physical. What he said was, go down and take the physical and don't take the step forward. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, there's a point where if you take the step forward, you've indicated you're willing to, you're voluntarily entering the armed forces. And that's part of the induction process. And I said, well, wait, how will I know? I was afraid that I was going to be told, you just crossed the line. You get on the bus. And he said, no, you'll know. It was very, very easy to tell. It was a whole ritual that they did. They said, you will now take the step forward. There were like 12 or 18 of us in a little room. You will now take the step forward, indicating that you are voluntarily taking your place in the United States Armed Forces. Everybody in the room took the step forward. I just stood there, and they all went, whoa, because they'd heard that there were people protesting the war, and not going when they were called. They didn't expect to see it happen. And I just went up and signed. I had to sign something. I had to sign a statement in the office of the head of that office. And he read me my rights, sounding very bored. He obviously done this many times,
Yeah.
Okay, you have indicated that you don't, but legally he had to allow me to make a statement. And my statement was, I cannot in all conscience go along with this induction notice I've received because it's illegal. And on that basis, I was out. It took several months for that to happen. But once I turned 26, it was over. They stopped chasing me. But the thing is, they had broken the law. So they could never take me to court and say, this guy refused to go. Right. So I never had to go to Canada. I was seriously considering going to Canada. If it was a choice of going to Canada or going to jail, I figured Canada was better than jail. I had thought about it. I mean, that was the situation I was in.
Certainly more scenic.
So there was that on top of, putting myself through college and everything else that I had to deal with. I mean, the next day after this whole thing with the draft board, I got up and went to work on another chapter of the Marx Brothers book. And the Marx Brothers book was referred to as the Marx Brothers book of all time. The title I had for it was Stars of Bedlam. I thought, okay, pun on Stars of Bethlehem and the idea that the Marx Brothers are Hollywood stars.
Sure.
Okay, I thought that might go. My subtitle, which I dreamed up while I was in Minocqua in 1969, my subtitle was Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Sometimes Zeppo. And I thought that would tell people it's about the Marx Brothers.
Right.
The book was sold to Simon & Schuster, and Michael Korda said, the Marx Brothers have to be in the title. He said, the ideal film book title is Hitchcock Truffaut. Hitchcock Truffaut is, it's a Simon & Schuster book, but it came out while I was in grad school. So he was not going to call it Stars of Bedlam. That was out. Let's think of a real title. That was the tone of the conversation. And Bill Simon, who was also in the room, I think he was the one who was more excited about the book than Michael Korda ever was. Bill Simon from the Simon family of Simon & Schuster said, well, I don't see what's wrong with that subtitle, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Sometimes Zeppo. So that's how that became the title of the book. And if I was going to submit it as my thesis, we're back to 1970 now. If I was going to submit it as my thesis, it had to be typed on a special kind of paper according to a special kind of specification. I mean, this made my head spin to read this. The paper was 8.5 by 11, but it had blue lines. And those were the margins. Those were the top, side, and bottom margins. You could not go outside of those margins. If you did, you were disqualified. And this was hard enough for me. I'm not a great typist. It was hard enough for me to type up all these chapters that I've been submitting.
Yeah. There's a certain irony there, too, given that the subject matter is the Marx Brothers.
The Marx Brothers, yeah. And I had all sorts of clever... In my original papers, the Marx Brothers dialogue was marginal gloss alongside my text. And I typed it that way, but I set up the margins and I made it work. And that's part of why people liked it. But it wasn't submitted that way. I knew I was never going to get a typist to do it that way. Anyway, there was at the theater arts department a girl who had done several theses and knew how to type that way, charged me $1 a page. I didn't know I had a 500-page book, you know. But I had these 2 fellowships, and I had the money, so I could afford to pay her at $1 a page to type up the final version of the book. And that was the version that was submitted as my thesis, September 1st, 1970. So that was by now the second draft of the book, but there were more revisions when it got published and everything else. And it had the subtitle now inserted on it as the title of the book. So, you know, so that, my friends, is how we fly across the ocean.
Oh, wow. Bada bing. That was perfect. Okay. Once again, thank you for the generosity of your time. I know the scheduling wasn't necessarily optimal for you, but I think we're getting off on a really great foot.
I appreciate all that. That's very nice. And I really appreciate hearing from time to time how much people love this book. I have to say, I hoped it would be successful and people liked it, you know, and I won 2 fellowships with it. The second fellowship, they weren't going to give me because I just won the AFI fellowship. But they looked at their rules and it said, you have to give this award based on merit. Need was not supposed to be a consideration.
Yeah.
So the fact that there probably were needier people, they didn't have a better manuscript and they said, we have to give it to you. So there it was. But I still hear how much people like the book.
Yes.
It's absolutely amazing. I had absolutely no thought that 50 years after it was published, I would still be talking about it.
Yeah. Well, here we are. Thank you again. And I know the Marx Brothers are not your only area of expertise. So I fully anticipate that there may come another opportunity for us to talk some more about one of the other subjects on which you were so well versed.
Thank you. And I'm glad I changed my mind and decided to go ahead with this. I did think about postponing it, but you were so disappointed. I thought, why do that?
Well, I'm good at whining. So I'm glad it worked because it's really going to get things off on a very positive note, I think. And hopefully the podcast will be well received and this will just be the beginning of many great things to come. So now we see if subsequent episodes can meet the standard that has been set by Joe as the first guest on Movie Nights and Matinees. In episode 2, coming next week, that challenge will fall to Scott Tracy Griffin, the go-to expert on all things Tarzan and Edgar Rice Burroughs. Join us as we discuss Lord Greystoke and his many screen incarnations. Until then,
I'm going.